most of you who have made it this far. Dr. Jason W. Morrison, theologist. I'm trying to do a theological audit, which is straightening out theology. In the Watchtower study article 41 of the Watchtower study edition for October 2019, Staying Faithful Through the Tribulation, and it's turned out to be a bit of a rabbit hole of theological mess suited to their organisation. But I've come up to this one, paragraph 12. How has the faithful and discreet slave been preparing us for what is coming in the future? Now, identifying the faithful and discreet slave, oh my gosh, I don't know how they've come up with the idea that they are the faithful and discreet slave, but nevertheless they have. And it's this bunch of people, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society governing body. I don't know all the I know Anthony Morris, I know Garrett Loesch, Jeffrey Jackson, Samuel Hurd, Stephen Lett. Not sure of this bloke, and I'm not sure of that bloke, but I do believe, is that Cook? That guy there, I'm not sure, but this is the governing body of the Jehovah Witnesses. Interesting bunch of people. They're leading the deception. To be honest, the only way I can say it is they're leading the deception, but these people are highly theologically deceived. I don't know how else you can put it. It's just the way it is. But thinking they're the faithful and discreet slave of Matthew. And I think we'll go to Matthew 24 in its entirety. This passage is gone over and over. People have gone over and over this again and again and again. Who really is the faithful and discreet slave whom his master appointed over his domestics to give them food, give them their food at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so. Well, the poor old faithful and discreet slave's in for a shock because they've been lying to their members. Now, this idea that the governing body thinks they're the faithful and discreet slave of Matthew 24. My goodness me, I've talk about use religion as a business shopfront. These guys are the best in the business. I tell you, they've made billions, not millions, billions out of religion.
What does the master expect from us?
There's something that desperately needs to be addressed about the Jehovah's Witnesses, and that is this faithful slave doctrine that they have, that the account of Matthew chapter 24, it's basically Jesus talking to his followers, and he uses parables, illustrations, for how his followers need to be constantly alert and ready and on the watch for the day of his master returning, basically Armageddon. For some reason, I never thought to question the whole faithful and discreet slave thing until very recently. I don't know if you saw the video where I confronted the elders at the Kingdom Hall and had a discussion with them. Well, one of their biggest points that they used to deflect my reasoning and my questioning was, well, who has Jehovah appointed over the flock? Who has been given the authority? And I said, Jesus? And he says, no, the faithful slave, as it says in the Bible. So he used that faithful and discreet slave thing basically to save his entire belief system.
I really wish that there was more of an exchange and it wasn't just 7 guys who are wrong a lot handing down all the information. Does that make sense at all?
It's nothing we haven't heard before. 2 thoughts to that. Number one, Jesus said that the spiritual food comes from where?
From Jesus?
From the faithful and discreet slave, who the master is appointed. The master is Jesus. He controls the congregation. He's appointed the faithful and discreet slave. That's prophesied.
And that got me thinking, this faithful slave thing, like, how much basis does it actually have? How much weight does it really hold? And so I started looking at the actual doctrine and the actual scripture and what the context of it is. What's great about going over this right now is that JW Broadcasting has done a video that directly ties in to this subject, and I wanted to pick apart this episode of JW Broadcasting for you.
In Jesus' prophecy about the conclusion of the system of things, he not only gives us signs as to when the end would be close, he also gives us pointed advice and counsel on how to be prepared and ready for Jehovah's Day, what the Master expects from us when he comes.
So I want you to pay attention. Right there he just said that in this scripture, Jesus is talking to all of us and giving us pointed parables and illustrations and advice for how to be aware and ready for the new system. But notice how the language changes very quickly in just a minute.
Now we look at our text for today here in Matthew 24, verse 33. Jesus says, likewise also you, when you see all these things. So obviously this applies to the anointed.
Whoa, wait, hold on a second. You were just talking about how the scriptures were addressed to all of us, and then all of a sudden you're saying that this chapter applies obviously to the anointed? Wait a second. No. Obviously, why is that obvious? Can we go back for a second? What? Well, maybe, okay, we'll watch more. Maybe he addresses why this obviously applies to the anointed and not all Christians and all followers of Jesus.
And the parables throughout Matthew 24 and 25 apply to the anointed. Of course, those of the other sheep can benefit greatly from the advice because it will help them also to be in a state of preparedness and to be acceptable to the Master.
So you're not going to talk at all about why it's obvious that the scripture mostly applies to the anointed? Oh, well. Well, why does it matter? Why is that a big deal? Well, because if you look just a little further in Matthew chapter 24, if you go to verse 45, is the scripture that they apply to the anointed as meaning a greater fulfillment, that they are this mythical, entitled people called the faithful slave. So whereas his video started out talking about how this chapter was addressed to all Christians, he quickly threw in there that this was mostly directed at the anointed, because of this one little verse that they took very literally to mean them.
Now he says here in our text, know that he is near at the doors. So when they see all these things, they will know his coming is imminent.
Who will know? The anointed or Christ's followers? Why the distinction? Why do they put so much emphasis on these words applying to the anointed?
We cannot second guess when the Master will come. He's given us work to do. It's our responsibility to do the work.
He almost said it's our job. He almost said it's our job to do the work. And instead he goes, it's our responsibility to do the work. I think he originally wanted to say job, but then maybe one of the governing body members were like, that sounds a little too harsh. Let's rephrase it to sound a little less obligatory.
As to when the time will come. Do we really focus on that assignment we have to do? If we try to calculate exactly the moment when Christ will come, it will debilitate our efforts.
I know you didn't just say that. I know you didn't just say that.
Because Christ said, you know neither the hour, and at an hour you do not think to be it, he will come. We cannot second guess when the Master will come.
You mean like all the times you second guessed when the Master was coming? You know, 1914, 1925, 1975. I'm sure I missed a few, but what about the generation doctrine, and then that changing to one generation to two overlapping generations, second guessing who would be alive and when the end would come before some people died, giving you an idea of a time frame. Not second guessing, not at all. No, we do not second guess when the Master will arrive. We don't do that.
And we have work to do, so let's get on with our work. We know how to do it. We know what we must do. We work along with a faithful and discreet slave.
So yes, let's get on with our work. I wanted to address this point of the faithful slave, why they think they are the faithful slave, and why it's actually bullshit. Alright, so let's jump right in. Matthew chapter 24 is where the Jehovah's Witnesses, the governing body, get a lot of their... They use some of the points in this chapter to mean way more than it was ever meant to mean. And if you read Matthew chapter 24 in its entirety, it starts out with a prophecy of what's going to happen at the conclusion of this system of things. He's talking about the Great Tribulation, the sun being darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from heaven, heavens will be shaken, blah, 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 blah. Verse 31, and he will send out his angels with a great trumpet sound, and they will gather his chosen ones together from the four winds, from one extremity of the heavens to their other extremity. And verse 32 is where the scripture changes. Jesus begins to give illustrations to his followers on how to be on the watch so that they're not caught off guard when the end of this system of things comes. Verse 32, he gives the illustration from the fig tree, and he actually says outright that it's an illustration. He says, "Now learn this illustration from the fig tree. Just as soon as its young branch grows tender and sprouts its leaves, you know that summer is near. Likewise also you, when you see all these things, know that he is near at the doors. Truly I say to you that this generation will by no means pass away until all these things happen." He was saying that when the time comes that you start to see these signs, by no means will that generation pass away before the end comes. Now the Jehovah's Witnesses take that to mean, well, World War I was the sign. We saw all the signs that are in Jesus' prophecy at World War I. And so surely the anointed alive to see World War I would live to see the end of this system. Well, that didn't come true. So maybe this greater fulfillment of theirs doesn't hold as much weight as they thought. Of course, now they've extended it to mean 2 generations overlapping as one, which is ridiculous. But anyways, let's stay on point here. He gives the illustration of the fig in verse 32. And then he goes on to do several more illustrations, driving home the same point, to not to be caught unaware when the Master returns. Verse 36, "Concerning that day and hour nobody knows, neither the angels of the heavens, nor the Son, but only the Father. For just as the days of Noah were, so the presence of the Son of Man will be. right there in verse 37, Jesus uses it yet again, another example, an illustration. Verse 40, he says, "Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken along, and the other abandoned." Verse 41, 2 women will be grinding at the hand mill, one will be taken along, and the other abandoned. Keep on the watch, therefore, because you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Yet again, another illustration. Some people will be paying attention and be saved, but there are those who will not be paying attention and will not be saved. So we're seeing a theme here. These are all parables that Jesus is using to drive home a point. And then, following this, is the famous faithful and discreet slave verse. Verse 45. Who really is the faithful and discreet slave, whom his master appointed over his domestics to give them their food at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so. Truly I say to you, he will appoint him over all his belongings. Yet again, just another parable. For some reason, the governing body took this a step further. Well, Jesus was using all these parables and illustrations to drive home a point, but this faithful slave character that he mentions, maybe this is a real person or group of people. Maybe it has a greater fulfillment in our day, and we are the faithful and discreet slave. Happy are we. And they do this quite ingeniously, making themselves this example, this parable, this character that Jesus mentions. Because by doing that, they give themselves authority that was never meant to be given to any group of people in our day. It says, "Master, whom his master appointed over his domestics." So now, by making this parable a real thing, a real group of people, that is them, they now have been appointed over God's domestics. And it is their charge to give us, or all humankind, food at the proper time. Brilliant, ingenious. And it works. You know why it works? Well, they think it works. They use this scripture anytime you question the governing body at all. And that's exactly what happened when I went to the meeting and confronted those 2 elders. When I questioned what makes the governing body able to change doctrines as opposed to any other earnest Bible student. Well, they can change stuff. Well, what does the Bible say about a group of people who are appointed over the flock? I was truly dumbfounded. I was like, what do you mean? He says, well, he referred to this scripture. Well, Jesus talked about a faithful and discreet slave who will be appointed over all of God's domestics and distribute food at the proper time. Gotcha! The governing body is that faithful slave, obviously. First of all, there is nothing in this chapter to make me believe that Jesus was talking literally about a group of people called the faithful slave who would obviously be appointed to do these things. It was simply an illustration to drive home the point that happy is the one who's paying attention and doesn't have his pants down when God comes back to usher in Armageddon. That's all he was trying to say. We know this because of the context. In the past, I don't know, 20, 30 verses, he gave like 3 of the exact same sort of examples driving home this point. Also, I would like to point out that in verse 47, it says, "Truly I say to you, he will appoint him over all his belongings." That is only after the master comes and finds him doing so. So, according to that verse, let me read it so it's less confusing. I said that wrong. Verse 46, "Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so. Truly I say to you, he will appoint him over all his belongings. So when you read it, actually they're not being appointed over his belongings until after he returns and finds them being loyal. So really, the faithful and discreet slave, if it has a greater fulfillment, they don't actually get appointed over God's belongings until after the master returns in Armageddon and finds them doing what they were supposed to be doing. So they really don't even have any authority based on their own misconstrued verse until after Armageddon, or after the Great Tribulation starts. The other reason why I know that there's no greater fulfillment to what Jesus is saying is because directly after that, he goes on to talk about an evil slave. Oh, we're the faithful and discreet slave. Well, there is the evil slave that Jesus talked about directly after talking about the faithful and discreet slave. Yeah, in verse 48 it says, "But if ever that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master is delaying,' and he starts to beat his fellow slaves and to eat and drink with the confirmed drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day that he does not expect, and in an hour that he does not know, and he will punish him with the greatest severity, and will assign him his place with the hypocrites. There is where his weeping and his gnashing of his teeth will be." And that's the end of the chapter 24. So why aren't they trying to figure out, since they've nailed it, since they've had this great revelation, oh, this parable that Jesus came up with to drive home this point actually has a greater fulfillment, that the faithful and discreet slave is a real, not just one person, but a group of people, that is us, and we are appointed, yada, yada, yada. So if they did that, why didn't they then go, well, wait a minute. If that's the case, maybe this evil slave is a real person or group of people that has a greater fulfillment. And in that verse it says, "And he starts to beat his fellow slaves and to eat and drink with the confirmed drunkards." So this evil slave must be beating his fellow slaves. So now this tends to imply, if you stick with this governing body reasoning, that some counterpart of the governing body, some affiliates of the governing body, will begin to beat on the fellow slaves. Why haven't they identified who this evil slave is? Since it must also have a greater fulfillment, right? Wouldn't it have to be other members of the same slave class that are defecting? Because it says that he beats his fellow slaves. And to be fair, there was Raymond Franz, who began to beat the living daylights out of the governing body by pointing out all the hypocrisy and exposing a lot of the backwards thinking and just general untruths of the governing body. How it was so driven by policy rather than actual holy inspiration. Could Raymond Franz have been the evil slave that Jesus spoke about? Maybe the greater fulfillment is, maybe Raymond Franz was the evil slave in a greater fulfillment. But that's not fair, because the governing body claims to be the faithful and discreet slave, and that's like 7 people. Well, it is 7 now, there was more before. Some of them have died. How come there's only one guy that gets to be this evil slave? You know, it's just too much of a stretch. It's a case of some Bible students reading way too much into the point that Jesus was trying to make. It's bogus. It's phony. It makes no sense to me. I'm sorry. If this is all they have to imply that they are given authority over the congregations to make decisions for all of Christ's followers, I don't think it's strong enough. It does not have a leg to stand on. Might I also point out that as far as I know, this is the only mention in the Bible of a faithful and discreet slave. This is it, just in this parable. Parable, people. This was not a literal decree. This was not a prophecy. This is one among many parables to drive home a point. That's it. I don't know, guys. Read it for yourselves and tell me what you think. Now that you're out of the propaganda machine and you take a fresh look at some of these scriptures, maybe you can come to a different understanding. That's what I did. Oh, and by the way, right there in verse 35, directly after verse 34, which is the famous generation verse, it says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." Heaven and earth will pass away? Wait a minute. You mean to tell me you read into all this talk about a greater fulfillment of the faithful and discreet slave parable, but you didn't stop and wonder what Jesus meant by heaven and earth will pass away? Doesn't that statement kind of blow away your entire doctrine about living on earth in a paradise? Jesus just said that the earth will pass away. You just said it like point blank. It will pass away. Maybe they're focusing on the wrong scriptures. Alright, well that's my rant for this week. Sorry I've been really busy with holiday stuff and haven't been able to do as many videos as I like to. But I'm still here, and I'm still very much planning on creating many more videos to come. I've still got a lot of ideas for things that I want to do, and some of them are pretty cool and exciting. You're gonna love it. Stay tuned. Thank you for watching, and Happy New Year's, guys.